The cold, infinite expanse of space stretched out before Captain Kaelen Vance as he stood at the helm of the Ravager. His ship, battered and patched together from scraps of metal and old technology, cut through the void, a ghost ship of its own, in the lawless fringes of the galaxy. The stars outside shimmered with distant, unreachable light, but Kaelen couldn't feel the awe they should have inspired. He'd seen too many stars flicker out in his lifetime to waste his time admiring them. Kaelen wasn't the same man he used to be. Once he had served in the Federation Navy, a promising officer with a reputation for leading difficult missions to success. But that was before the Astral Jackal mission, before everything fell apart. Now Kaelen made a living as a privateer, smuggling, hunting bounties, navigating dangerous parts of space where the law didn't reach. He had a small ragtag crew, and the Ravager was his home, a place where he could escape the memories, the mistakes, and the ghosts of his past. But no matter how far he traveled, no matter how many sectors he crossed, those ghosts always followed. He had made peace with it, or at least that's what he told himself. Peace was the kind of lie you told when you didn't want to face the truth. The truth was, Kaelen hadn't moved on. And that truth was about to catch up with him. It started with a message, an old, frequency encrypted, buried in a part of the ship's communication system Kaelen hadn't touched in years. It buzzed to life in the dead of night, a whisper that broke through the silence. Kaelen was sitting alone in his quarters when he heard it. The Astral Jackal is no longer a ghost. It hunts again. His breath caught in his chest. The message was brief, but the name was enough to tear open a wound he had long tried to bury. Alix Gorman, his closest friend, his comrade on the Jackal, who had disappeared years ago when the ship was lost. They had both been part of the crew sent to investigate, a strange anomaly, but the mission had gone wrong, so terribly wrong. The Jackal had vanished into the unknown, and Kaelen had been left behind, the sole survivor. Or so he had thought. Now, Alix was alive. Or at least, something claiming to be him was reaching out. Kaelen couldn't ignore it. Not this time. The message wasn't just a distress call, it was a lure, pulling him back to the one place he swore he'd never return, the wreckage of the Astral Jackal. He stood up from his chair, staring out at the empty space ahead. For the first time in years, he felt the old pull, the need to find the truth, to face what had happened. The weight of the decision crushed down on him, but there was no turning back now. Alix had left a trail, and Kaelen was going to follow it no matter where it led. With a sigh, he turned toward the bridge, his mind already racing through the steps. He would need to assemble a crew. This mission would be dangerous, and he couldn't do it alone. He would need Sera, the engineer, Kade, the sharpshooter, and Lira, the spiritualist who believed in things Kaelen had long since dismissed. They would follow him into the dark once more, into the heart of the Astral Jackal. The Ravager drifted in the silent void, its engines humming softly as Kaelen stood in the dim light of the bridge, staring at the encrypted message on the screen. His fingers hovered over the controls, hesitating. The words on the display, the name Alix Gorman, made it feel like the room was closing in on him. He'd spent years trying to forget the Astral Jackal, to forget the failure, the lost comrades, the death of the mission. But now the past was coming back, and it had a name. Alix. His heart thudded against his chest. He couldn't ignore it. No matter how much he tried, the ghosts of his past wouldn't let him go. "Captain," came Sera's voice, breaking his trance. The young engineer stepped onto the bridge, her face lit by the glow of the ship's control panels. She was sharp, always focused on the task at hand, but even she could sense something was off. "You look like you've seen a ghost. What's going on?" Kaelen slowly turned toward her, his gaze steady but distant. "The Astral Jackal isn't just a ghost ship anymore," he said, his voice low. "It's hunting again." Sera frowned, but she didn't need to ask. She'd heard the stories just like everyone else in the fringes of space. The Jackal had disappeared years ago under mysterious circumstances, its entire crew presumed dead, its wreckage never found. But Kaelen knew better. He'd been there. He knew the truth was far darker than anyone could imagine. Someone's out there, Kaelen continued, almost to himself. Someone from my past, and I'm going to find them. Sera's fingers hovered over the ship's console, tapping a few keys. You think this is real? We're talking about a ghost ship, Kaelen. There's no way it could just pop back up. I know it's real, Kaelen replied, his voice hardening. And I need you to help me track it. Sera hesitated, but then nodded. She knew Kaelen's persistence well enough to understand there was no talking him out of this. Fine. I'll get the systems ready. But we're going into uncharted territory. If we're going to find it, we need to be prepared. Within minutes, the Ravager's engines powered up, and they set course for the coordinates Kaelen had mapped from the message. The ship shuddered as it moved into the outskirts of the unexplored region, the stars becoming more distant and unfamiliar. The silence outside the ship was unnerving, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. Meanwhile, Kade stood in the back of the bridge, his eyes scanning the displays. His arms were crossed, his usual scowl on his face. You're actually going after it, huh? Kade's voice was tinged with disbelief, though there was no hiding his curiosity. A ghost ship that's been gone for years. What's next, Kaelen? You're going to bring back the dead? I'm not here to argue, Kaelen said. We've got a job to do. Right. A job, Kade muttered under his breath. Just make sure you're not dragging us into something we can't get out of. Lira, the spiritualist, had been silent until now. She sat cross-legged in the corner, her eyes closed in deep meditation. When she spoke, her voice was calm, almost otherworldly. The Jackal is calling to you, she said, her voice soft but unwavering. It's no mere ship, it has a purpose, and so do you. Kaelen turned to her, his brow furrowed. What do you mean by that? The ship's essence. It has been altered. It's no longer just a vessel. It is a being, and it hungers. Lira continued, her eyes still closed. It will not give you what you seek without cost. Kaelen ignored her, his focus entirely on the task ahead. He knew Lira believed in things that others dismissed, but there was no time for spiritual mumbo-jumbo now. The truth was out there, and he was going to find it. As they entered the dark zone of space, the sensors began to malfunction. The readings flickered on the screen, becoming erratic and unpredictable. Sera worked quickly trying to stabilize the ship's systems, but it was as if the entire sector was fighting them. Something's off, Sera muttered, her eyes darting over the consoles. The entire space-time fabric in this area is... Before she could finish, a sharp, sudden tremor rocked the Ravager. The ship veered to the side, its hull groaning as if being pulled by an invisible force. Everyone brace, Kaelen barked, grabbing onto the nearest console as the ship lurched violently. On the view screen, a large mass began to emerge from the darkness, the silhouette of the Astral Jackal. It was enormous, its jagged edges barely visible in the pale light of distant stars. It was no longer a derelict ship. It was alive. The structure pulsed, almost like it was breathing, and the lights that flickered across its hull seemed to beckon them forward. Kaelen's breath caught in his throat. There was no mistaking it now. They had found the Jackal, and it had found them. Before Kaelen could issue any orders, the ship's tractor beam locked onto the Ravager, pulling them toward the ghostly wreck. The crew scrambled to hold their positions. As the ship was dragged toward the Astral Jackal, Sera's hands flew over the controls, but it was useless. The ship was caught in its grip. We can't break free. Whatever this is, it's too strong. Kade drew his weapon, eyes scanning the view of the approaching ship. We're going in, aren't we? Kaelen nodded grimly. We have no choice now. Get ready for whatever comes next. The Ravager was pulled helplessly toward the Astral Jackal, its engines screaming as they strained against the unrelenting tractor beam. Kaelen stood at the helm, his jaw clenched, eyes narrowed as the ghost ship loomed ever closer. The stars, that had once felt like distant beacons, now seemed swallowed by the ship's immense shadowed hull, and the reality of what they were about to face settled heavily in the pit of Kaelen's stomach. We're getting close, Sera said, her voice shaky as she worked feverishly to override the ship's systems. But there was no way out. The Jackal had them now. Kaelen felt the weight of the past pressing down on him, reminding him of the last time he had set foot on the Astral Jackal. The mission had been a disaster, an expedition to investigate an unknown anomaly. The Jackal's crew had been a mix of military personnel and scientists, and they were supposed to be ready for anything. But they hadn't been ready for the ancient alien force that had twisted the ship and its crew into something beyond human comprehension. Something that could manipulate space and time, something that could drive men mad. The crew had been lost to it, and now Kaelen had come back. The Ravager's hull clanged against the Jackal's, and a strange hollow sound reverberated through the ship's interior. They had docked, but it felt less like a landing and more like an invitation. The air in the Ravager grew heavier, charged with the same unsettling energy Kaelen remembered from the Jackal's last days. He could feel the presence of the ship, a consciousness that existed in every corner of it, watching them, waiting. "Prepare to board," Kaelen ordered, his voice steady but filled with determination. The crew nodded, each one silently steeling themselves for what lay ahead. Kaelen led the way to the docking ramp. The air outside was cold, oppressive. It felt as though the universe itself had shrunken, closing in around them as they stepped into the Jackal's eerie interior. The corridors were narrow, the metal walls sleek but somehow wrong, as if they hadn't been touched in years. The dim lighting cast long shadows, and strange faint sounds echoed from within as though the ship were alive, breathing in its own forgotten dark. "We're not alone," Kade murmured, his hand on his weapon. The sharp-eyed mercenary was always on edge, and this place, this cursed ship, was unsettling even to him. "No kidding," Sera muttered, her voice tight with anxiety. She was scanning the walls with her handheld scanner, but there was no readout. No life signs. No signs of any technology running, just an eerie, unnatural silence. Lira, who had been unusually quiet so far, stepped forward, her eyes closed in concentration. "The Jackal is calling. It's waiting. It wants us here." Kaelen turned to her. "What does that mean?" "It's not just a ship. It's something older. Something that's grown beyond its original purpose," Lira explained softly. "It's feeding, and we are its prey." Kaelen didn't have time for spiritual riddles. His focus was on finding answers. And finding Alix. "Let's move," he snapped. As they navigated deeper into the ship, the atmosphere grew heavier, oppressive. The walls pulsed with a strange energy, and the deeper they went, the more it felt as though the ship were pressing in on them, watching them. A shiver ran down Kaelen's spine, but he kept his resolve. He'd come here to find the truth, not to let fear stop him. They reached what appeared to be the central hub of the Jackal, a cavernous room filled with abandoned consoles, their screens cracked and shattered. But something wasn't right. The equipment looked too advanced for a ship that had been lost for years. And then they saw it. In the center of the room, a figure stood, back turned to them. His silhouette was unmistakable. "Alix," Kaelen whispered, his breath catching in his throat. The figure didn't respond. It remained perfectly still, like a statue, almost too still. Kaelen stepped forward, his voice a mixture of hope and caution. "Alix, is that really you?" The figure slowly turned. It was Alix. But it wasn't. His face was gaunt, hollow, eyes glowing with an unnatural light. His once familiar features were twisted, distorted by something that had taken root deep inside him. "It's not him, Kaelen," Sera said, her voice laced with horror. "He's something else." Alix, or whatever had become of him, spoke, in a voice that seemed to echo from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You shouldn't have come here, Kaelen, I warned you. The Jackal has chosen us. We are its keepers now, and you will join us." A chill ran through the crew as the words sank in. The Jackal hadn't just taken its crew. It had changed them, turned them into something far worse. And now it was after them too. "You've become part of the ship," Kaelen said, his voice filled with disbelief. "You're not Alix anymore. Alix's Twisted smile stretched across his face. I am the ship now. We are one. And I will not let you leave. Before Kaelen could react, the walls around them began to shift, groaning and creaking as if the ship itself were coming alive. The air thickened, charged with a dark energy that made it hard to breathe. The very space around them seemed to warp, folding in on itself. Kaelen's mind raced. He needed to act. Fast. They were outnumbered, outmatched, and surrounded by something far older and far more powerful than anything they had encountered. Kade raised his weapon, but the atmosphere was growing unstable. Sera pulled out her tools, trying to tap into the ship's systems, but the energy from the Jackal's core interfered with everything. We need to get out, Sera said urgently. This place. It's changing us. But Kaelen wasn't going to leave. Not yet. We're not running. We're finding out what happened to Alix and we're ending this. The ship continued to pulse with energy, and the crew braced themselves for what would come next. The true danger of the Astral Jackal was only beginning to reveal itself. It was more than just a haunted wreck. It was a living entity, and now it had set its sights on Kaelen and his crew. The walls of the Astral Jackal seemed to close in on them, the pulsating energy from its core reverberating through the very air they breathed. Kaelen's heart raced, his breath quickening as he faced the twisted form of Alix. The man who had once been his friend, his comrade in arms, was now something far worse, something that had been corrupted by the ship, bound to its malevolent will. We're not here to join you, Alix, Kaelen said, his voice steady, though his mind raced with uncertainty. He couldn't afford to hesitate now, not with everything on the line. His crew was in danger, and the truth about the Astral Jackal had only become more horrifying with each passing minute. Alix tilted his head, his twisted smile never faltering. You never understood, Kaelen. The ship has chosen. We are its keepers. And you will be too. You came here to find answers, but all you found is the inevitable. The Astral Jackal is not a ship. It is a gateway, a way to transcend, to become something greater. The walls around them groaned, shaking as though the ship were alive, feeding off the dark energy that crackled through it. Kaelen could feel, it too, the oppressive weight of the Jackal's power. The ship's influence stretched beyond mere technology. It was something ancient, something eldritch. The crew was being suffocated, trapped by the ship's unholy will. Kaelen, Sera, gasped, pulling at his arm. We can't fight this. We need to shut it down. It's too powerful. The ship is alive, and it wants us to join it. We can't win this battle with guns or tech. We have to destroy the core. Kaelen nodded, his mind already calculating the next move. The Jackal's influence was growing stronger by the second. The crew's lives were on the line, and if they didn't act fast, they would all be swallowed up by the ship's insidious force. We don't have a choice, Kaelen said, turning to Kade. We're going to the core. Sera, can you bypass the systems? Sera's face was pale, her hands trembling as she looked at the walls of the ship, now contorting like living flesh. I'll try. But it's not going to be easy. The Jackal is in everything. Its systems, its structure. We're walking into the heart of it. Then let's move, Kaelen said, his voice resolute. The team began to move toward the heart of the ship, the only way to end the nightmare and free themselves from its grip. The corridors twisted around them, impossible angles and shifting walls that seemed to taunt their every step. The Jackal wasn't just a ship. It was a maze, a sentient labyrinth that fought against them at every turn. The deeper they went, the more the ship began to feel like a living thing, the walls pulsing as if it had a heartbeat. We're getting close, Kaelen said, his hand tightening around his blaster. They rounded the final corner, and there it was, the core of the Astral Jackal. It was massive, an otherworldly structure at the center of the ship, throbbing with energy, sending out waves of oppressive force. The air shimmered around it, distorting like heat rising from a fire. But it wasn't just the core that caught Kaelen's attention. It was what surrounded it. A swarm of figures, distorted versions of the Jackal's original crew. Alix stood at the front, his eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. a twisted expression of both madness and serenity on his face. "You can't stop it," Alix's voice boomed, amplified by the ship's unnatural resonance. "We are the keepers now. You cannot destroy what has already become eternal." Kaelen's grip tightened on his blaster. "We're not here to fight you, Alix. We're here to end this madness." The Jackal's distorted crew moved forward, their bodies writhing as if caught between two worlds. The ship had taken everything from them, everything they had been, and turned them into something unrecognizable. But Kaelen wouldn't give up. He couldn't. "Move!" Kaelen barked, and the crew rushed forward, weapons drawn. The Jackal's defenders lashed out, their movements unnatural, as though they were controlled by the very ship itself. The crew fought back, but they were outnumbered. Kade fired, each shot carefully aimed, but the figures kept coming, as if they were endless. Sera, using her knowledge of the ship's systems, tried to breach the core's defenses, but the ship's systems fought back, an invisible barrier of energy preventing her from getting close. Lira, sensing the ship's power, stepped forward, her voice a chant that resonated in the air. The words she spoke seemed to echo, vibrating with an otherworldly cadence. "Lira, what are you doing?" Kaelen shouted, but Lyra's eyes were closed in deep concentration. "Lira!" She spoke again, louder this time, and Kaelen could feel the air around him crackle with the intensity of her words. A wave of force surged from her, and the distorted crew faltered, if only for a moment. It was enough. "Now, Sera," Kaelen shouted. Sera ran forward, her fingers flying over the control panel that guarded the core. Sparks flew as the systems resisted, but Sera was relentless. With a final desperate push, she bypassed the core's defenses, and the ship's dark power crackled. "I've got it," Sera yelled, just as a surge of energy shot out from the core, blasting the crew back. The Jackal's defenders collapsed, their forms disintegrating into ash as the core's energy was shut down. But the battle wasn't over. The ship was dying, and it fought back with everything it had left. The corridors twisted and warped as the walls groaned, the Jackal's death throes shaking the very foundations of reality. Kaelen's eyes met Alix's one last time. The ship's influence was fading, but there was nothing left of Alix to save. The man Kaelen had known was gone, replaced by something that could never be fixed. "I'm sorry, old friend," Kaelen whispered, his voice hoarse. "But you were never supposed to be part of this." With a final heart-wrenching scream, Alix's form collapsed into nothingness as the Jackal's influence crumbled. The core exploded in a blinding flash of energy, ripping through the ship and destroying the malevolent entity that had taken control of it. The Astral Jackal was no more. The blinding explosion of energy that ripped through the ship was unlike anything Kaelen had ever felt. It was as if time and space themselves had torn apart, unraveling in an instant. The ship, once a vast and mysterious entity, crumbled into a shell of its former self. The dark energy that had suffocated Kaelen and his crew was now dissipating, replaced by the cold, familiar stillness of space. Kaelen staggered, his body still vibrating from the shockwave, but he steadied himself and looked around. The Ravager had been pulled into the debris field, the ship groaning under the strain of the blast, but it was alive. They were alive. For the moment, that was all that mattered. Sera was already at her station, her fingers flying over the controls as she worked to stabilize the ship. "We've got a hole in the hull, but we're still intact. I'll patch it up, but we're going to need to get out of here fast." Kade, his face bloodied but determined, walked up behind Kaelen, his weapon still drawn, though no longer aimed at anything. "We made it," he said, his voice rough but relieved. "But I can't shake the feeling that we didn't really win. This thing, whatever it was, it's still out there somewhere. And we're just lucky it didn't kill us." Kaelen nodded grimly. Kade wasn't wrong. The Astral Jackal might have been destroyed, but the horrors it had unleashed weren't so easily forgotten. They had faced something older than the galaxy itself, something that couldn't be wiped away with a single shot or explosion. Kaelen knew this wouldn't be the last time the galaxy saw such a force. "Let's not talk about what comes next, Kade," Kaelen replied, his voice quiet but firm. "For now, Let's just get out of here. The ship's systems flickered, back to life as Sera rerouted the power to their engines. The crew didn't speak much as the Ravager turned away from the wreckage of the Jackal and began its journey back toward the safety of known space. The tension between them had eased slightly, but the silence was heavy with the weight of what they had just experienced. They had lost so much. Alix was gone, nothing more than a twisted shadow of the man Kaelen had once called his friend. The crew of the Astral Jackal had become nothing more than a warning, a ghostly testament to the ship's dark power, and yet in some way Kaelen felt the loss of Alix as his own failure. He had promised to return for him to bring him home. But what had he found? A hollow shell, a man who had been consumed by something far beyond him. I should have done something sooner, Kaelen muttered to himself, his voice barely a whisper. He hadn't saved Alix. He hadn't saved any of them. Lira, who had remained quiet until now, stepped up beside him. Her eyes were distant, almost knowing. "You did what you could," she said softly. "There are some things we aren't meant to save. Some things are already lost before we even know they're gone." Kaelen looked at her, her words settling in his chest. She was right, of course. There were some things beyond their control. And yet, the weight of Alix's death, his failure, still hung heavy on him. It always would. As the Ravager drifted through the silent void, Kaelen turned his gaze toward the distant stars, where a future he couldn't quite envision awaited. The journey had taken everything from him, his past, his friend, his peace of mind. But there was still something left inside him, a drive to keep moving forward, to keep fighting, to keep surviving. He wasn't sure where it would lead, but he knew he couldn't stop. The crew of the Ravager had been through hell together, and they had survived. That was something, at least. And for now, that was enough. The Ravager continued its slow drift, toward known space, its engines humming softly as it cut through the void. The silence inside the ship was broken only by the low murmur of the crew tending to their duties. Kaelen sat alone in the galley, staring out at the stars. The vast emptiness of space had always been something he could both fear and embrace. But now it felt different, like something had shifted not just in the universe but in him. He had always been a soldier, a survivor, but this mission had changed him. It had reminded him of the fragility of everything they took for granted, the lives they lived, the people they loved, the ships they relied on. Everything could slip away in an instant. But there was something else, too. A strange sensation that lingered in the air. The Astral Jackal had been destroyed, but its echoes remained. Kaelen couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, something worse than the ship, something waiting to rise again. A greater darkness, something beyond the Jackal's reach. He glanced at the comm panel, the one that had brought him back into this nightmare. It sat there, dark and silent, but Kaelen knew it was only a matter of time before it sparked to life again. The universe had its secrets, and it wasn't done with him yet. The message would come, sooner or later, from somewhere, or someone. And when it did, Kaelen would be ready. He had no choice. He would face whatever came next, just as he had faced the Astral Jackal. But this time he wouldn't be alone. The stars outside flickered, and Kaelen stared at them, his expression unreadable. The galaxy was full of horrors, but it was also full of hope, and as long as he was still breathing, he would fight for the latter. He stood, moving toward the control room. He knew the crew was waiting, ready to face whatever was next. Just as they always had. Kaelen had survived the Jackal, but the real fight was only beginning.